Was this part of the game too? His voice was pure ice, dripping with a corrosive sarcasm. The lost little family heirloom. See if the poor mechanic will take the bait. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the gleaming silver pocket watch onto the steel workbench. It landed with a sharp metallic clatter that felt like a slap. No. She cried, a raw, ragged sound. She rushed toward him, her hand outstretched. "Jake, you have to listen." He recoiled from her touch as if he'd been burned, stumbling backward, his heel catching the heavy base of the phoenix. There was a sickening groan of stressed metal, a horrifying, suspended second, and then a sound like a gunshot as the fresh weld snapped. The massive wing, a masterpiece of forged steel, tore free and crashed onto the marble floor with a deafening, echoing roar. The silence that followed was absolute, filled only with the image of a man's dream lying in a heap of twisted, worthless scrap. If this story is already touching your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more. The midnight storm was a familiar beast. To Jacob Williams, it was just another layer of sound, a wet, percussive rhythm against the cavernous roof of the old train station he called home. Outside, the world could drown. Inside, there was only the hiss of his welding torch, the sharp scent of ozone, and the steady, focused work of his hands. He was a king in a kingdom of rust and forgotten time, a 32-year-old man who had found his peace, not in the company of others, but in the solitude of giving discarded things a second life. His workshop, carved out of the old station master's office, was an island of intense light and purpose in an ocean of echoing darkness. Sparks flew from the tip of his torch, a cascade of miniature dying stars that illuminated the hulking form of his latest creation, a sculpture of a phoenix, its wings forged from the rusted steel of a 100-year-old boiler. It was his masterpiece, his bid for a city art commission that promised to lift him from a life of just getting by to one of quiet security. Tonight he was welding the final feather onto its magnificent wing, a delicate process that demanded all his attention. The rain, the wind, the rattling of loose metal somewhere on the roof. It was all just noise. Until it wasn't. It was a sound that didn't belong. Not the familiar groan of aging steel or the skittering of a rat in the walls. It was a soft, heavy thud from the direction of the grand concourse, followed by the faint, sharp clatter of something small hitting the marble floor. Jake froze his torch, hovering inches from the sculpture. He killed the flame, plunging the workshop into the dim glow of a single bare bulb. Silence rushed in, thick and heavy, broken only by the storm's relentless drumming. He was not a man who welcomed surprises. His life was a fortress built of routine and solitude, and any unexpected noise was a potential breach in the wall. He placed the torch on its cradle, his movements deliberate, silent. Wiping his hands on an old rag, he reached for a heavy iron wrench that lay on his workbench. It wasn't a weapon, not really, but its weight was a comfort. He moved out of the workshop, his work boots making no sound on the dusty concrete. The grand concourse opened before him like a tomb. Moonlight filtered through the storm clouds, and the tall, grime-streaked arched windows cast long skeletal shadows across the floor. The air was cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Every drip of water from the leaking ceiling echoed like a footstep. He held the wrench tight, his knuckles white, his senses on high alert. He scanned the vast, empty space, his eyes tracing the outlines of the old wooden benches bolted to the floor, like silent parishioners in a forgotten church. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire hall for a split second in a brilliant, sterile white. And in that flash, he saw it. Not a threat, not a thief, but a heap. A small, dark heap near the main entrance crumpled against the base of a massive stone pillar. It was motionless. Jake's first thought was of a vagrant seeking shelter, a common enough occurrence. His second thought, a colder one, was of trouble. He approached with the slow, measured tread of a man walking on thin ice. As he drew closer, the details began to resolve themselves in the gloom. It was a person, a woman. Her clothes, what he could see of them, were soaked through, clinging to a slender frame. They were dark, but even in the dim light, he could see they were made of fine material, utterly wrong for this place. A trench coat of some soft, expensive fabric, a pair of delicate shoes that were never meant for walking, now scuffed and mud-stained. He stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling over her. "Hey," he said, his voice, a low rumble that felt too loud in the silent hall. There was no response. He circled her slowly, the wrench still held at his side. Her hair, long and dark with rain, was splayed across the marble floor like spilled ink. One hand was curled loosely by her side, the other flung out fingers slightly parted. He nudged her shoulder with the toe of his boot. Nothing. The cold dread of finding a body began to creep up his spine. He knelt the rough iron of the wrench cold against his palm. He needed to know if she was breathing. He needed to know if he was now a witness to something terrible. He reached out his calloused fingers, hesitating before touching the side of her neck. He felt for a pulse, his touch clumsy, unfamiliar with the softness of another person's skin. For a moment, there was nothing but the cold, damp chill of her flesh. Then he felt it. A faint, thready flutter. Weak, but there. She was alive. Another bolt of lightning lit the concourse, and this time her face was thrown into sharp relief. She was young, barely out of her teens, he guessed. Her face was pale cheek pressed against the grimy floor, her features delicate, aristocratic. Even in unconsciousness, her brow was furrowed, a small crease of fear or pain between her eyebrows. She was out of place in a way that set every one of his alarms ringing. She wasn't just lost. She was a creature from another world crash-landed in his. This wasn't a problem he could just ignore until morning. This was a problem that could unravel the quiet, solitary life he had so carefully constructed. His mind raced. Call the police. An ambulance. That meant questions, reports his sanctuary invaded by uniforms and sterile authority. It meant explaining what a young, well-dressed white woman was doing unconscious in his abandoned train station in the middle of the night. His own presence here was tenuous, a fragile arrangement with the city. He didn't need that kind of attention. He could just walk away. Leave her be. Pretend he'd never seen her. By morning, she would either be gone, or she would be someone else's problem. It was the safe choice. The smart choice. He stood up, ready to turn, to retreat back to the predictable world of his workshop, to the hiss of the torch and the solid reality of steel. And then it came. From far down the tracks, a low, mournful sound began to build, cutting through the noise of the storm. It was the wail of the midnight freight train, the one train that still used these old lines. It was a sound he heard every night, a lonely cry in the dark that echoed the hollow spaces inside his own chest. It was the sound of passage of something lost moving through the darkness. The sound seemed to fill the station, to seep into the cold marble and vibrate up through the soles of his boots. He looked down at the girl. A stranger. A risk. A puzzle he had no desire to solve. But in the desolate cry of the train, he heard an echo of the fear on her face. He saw not just a problem, but a person, as lost and untethered in that moment as the lonely sound that now enveloped them both. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last 10 years, he set the wrench down on a nearby bench. The clang of iron on wood was a sound of decision. He knelt again, and this time his movements were different. No longer cautious, but purposeful. He slid one arm under her shoulders, the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight in his arms. He carried her out of the grand, echoing tomb of the concourse and into the small, warm pocket of life he had built for himself. He didn't take her to his own bed, but to a simple cot in the corner of his living space, a space he kept for nights when he was too tired to climb the stairs to his loft. He laid her down gently, her head lolled to the side, her breathing still shallow. For a long moment he just stood there looking down at her. This girl with her expensive ruined clothes and her air of a life he couldn't begin to imagine was now asleep in his home. A stray, a storm-tossed bird with a broken wing. He didn't know if he was doing the right thing. He only knew that leaving her on the cold floor was the wrong one. He pulled a coarse, clean wool blanket from a nearby chest and draped it over her, tucking it around her shoulders. Then he turned and walked back to his workshop. The phoenix awaited its final feather. He picked up his torch, the familiar weight, a small comfort. He fired it up, and the sharp hiss once again filled the silence. But something had shifted. The solitude was no longer absolute. There was another heartbeat in his kingdom, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had just washed through his door. Some treasures are only found in the wreckage. Ava woke to a world of grey light and aching bones. For a moment she was adrift, untethered from time and place. The air didn't smell like her bedroom, a sterile mix of lavender and air-conditioned quiet. This air was thick, ancient. It smelled of cold stone, damp metal, and something else. Something sharp and electric like the air after a thunderstorm. She was lying on a simple cot, a coarse wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Above her, a ceiling soared into a shadowy expanse, crisscrossed with massive steel beams. It was like waking up inside the rib cage of a leviathan. She sat up slowly, the blanket pooling in her lap. Across the vast open space, a man stood with his back to her, a silhouette against the bright, violent spray of an angle grinder. Sparks showered the concrete floor around him, and the high-pitched scream of the tool echoed through the cavernous hall. It was the man from the night before, the stranger who had carried her from the cold floor. The reality of her situation came rushing back. The flight, the storm, the desperate search for shelter. He must have sensed her movement, because the piercing shriek of the grinder died, replaced by a sudden ringing silence. He turned, lifting the heavy safety visor from his face. His expression was unreadable, his eyes shadowed in the morning light. He was tall, with the broad shoulders and thick forearms of a man who worked with his hands. He looked at her not with the warmth of a host, but with the flat, assessing gaze of a mechanic, looking at a complex problem he hadn't asked for. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Her voice was a dry rasp. Where am I?" "The old Union Yard station." He answered, his voice low and even. "You picked a hell of a place to take a nap." He gestured vaguely with the grinder. "Bathroom's through that door. It's got running water." "Mostly." He turned back to his work, the implication clear he had offered shelter, not conversation. Ava pushed herself off the cot, her muscles protesting. Her expensive clothes were stiff and wrinkled, a testament to her ordeal. She felt a profound sense of shame, of displacement. In the small makeshift bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face, staring at the stranger in the mirror. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. This was real. This wasn't some nightmare she could wake from. When she emerged, he had set a tin plate on a small, cluttered table. On it sat 2 pieces of toast, slightly blackened at the edges, and a mug of steaming black coffee. It was the most unappetizing, and at the same time the most welcome meal she had ever seen. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the mug. She took a hesitant bite of the toast. It was dry and tasted faintly of smoke. "Is this breakfast?" She asked the words out before she could stop them. "Usually it has a few more layers, and some color for decoration." He glanced over from his workbench, a flicker of something, amusement perhaps, or disdain, in his eyes. "There's only one layer here, the edible layer, and the decoration is charcoal, if I'm not paying attention. Welcome to the real world." She should have been offended. In her world, a comment like that would have been an insult. Here in this strange, forgotten place, it was just a statement of fact. She found herself letting out a small, surprised laugh. Right. The real world? He didn't smile, but the hard line of his jaw seemed to soften for a fraction of a second before he turned back to his work. While he worked, Ava began to explore. She walked out into the grand concourse, her footsteps echoing in the morning quiet. The storm had passed, and pale sunlight streamed through the high, dirty windows, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny diamonds. The scale of the place was breathtaking. Marble floors, cracked and stained with age, stretched out before her. Sunlight glinted off the brass fittings of the ticket counters, now green with verdigris. It was a palace in ruins. But it was his work that truly captured her. Scattered throughout the hall were his sculptures. They were magnificent, brutal, and beautiful all at once. A towering figure with wings made of rusted gears, a coiled serpent forged from old railway ties, a delicate flower whose petals were hammered from the hoods of wrecked cars. He wasn't just fixing things. He was taking the broken, the discarded, the forgotten, and giving them a new voice. He was telling stories in steel. As a photographer, she understood composition, light, and form. But this was something more. This was alchemy. She walked from piece to piece, her earlier fear completely replaced by a deep, resonant awe. This man, this silent, guarded stranger, possessed a soul that spoke a language she understood perfectly. He had a vision that could see the phoenix in the scrap heap. The realization made her think of her own life. The gilded cage, the carefully curated future, the arranged marriage to a man she didn't love. It was all a beautiful, polished surface, with nothing but rust underneath. Lost in thought, she found herself back at the spot where she had collapsed. She remembered the fall, the jarring impact, the small, sharp clatter of something hitting the floor. Her hand flew to her coat pocket. It was empty. A cold wave of panic washed over her, more intense than any fear she had felt the night before. "No," she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. She dropped to her knees, her hands frantically patting the floor, searching the cracks between the marble tiles. It was gone. The one thing that connected her to a past worth remembering. The one piece of her life that wasn't a lie. Her grandfather's pocket watch. An old, simple silver timepiece given to her by her mother. It was a symbol of a different kind of life, a life of quiet dignity her mother had always yearned for and never had. Losing it felt like losing the last piece of her mother, the last piece of herself. Tears pricked her eyes as she searched, her movements growing more frantic. It had to be here. Then a subtle shift in the light made her look up. Across the hall near the pillar where she had fallen, Jake was kneeling. He was perfectly still, his broad back to her. He wasn't working. He was looking down at something cradled in his palm. Sunlight from a high window caught the object, and it flashed a brilliant glint of polished silver. Ava froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was the watch, He didn't seem to notice her. He stared at the timepiece for a long moment, his head slightly tilted, as if listening to its silent story. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, his fingers closed around it, concealing it from view. He slipped his closed fist into the pocket of his worn denim jeans. Only then did he stand up and turn his eyes locking with hers from across the vast, silent hall. His face was a mask, his expression giving nothing away. But he knew. He knew she had been searching for it, and she knew that he had found it. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. The air between them thickened, charged with a new unspoken secret. The simple dynamic of rescuer and victim was gone. In its place was something far more complicated, a silent question that now hung in the dusty, sunlit air of the abandoned station. Trust is a delicate thing, easily broken, not so easily forged. The morning after the silent discovery of the watch, a fragile truce settled over the train station. It was a silence built not of peace, but of unspoken questions. Ava didn't ask for the watch back, and Jake didn't acknowledge he had it. The silver timepiece became a ghost between them, a tangible secret that hummed with a low, constant tension. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising of the sun through the dusty cathedral windows and the lonely cry of the midnight train. A strange Spartan routine began to form. He would work, and she would watch, a quiet observer in his kingdom of steel. But Ava was not built for idleness. The feeling of being a burden, a helpless guest, gnawed at her. One afternoon, as Jake was preparing to grind the sharp edges of a large sheet of metal, she stood up from the old bench she'd claimed as her own. "I want to help," she announced. Jake paused, the heavy grinder in his hand. He looked at her clean, soft hands, and the expensive, impractical clothes she still wore. Help with what? Anything, she insisted. "I can't just sit here. Teach me something. I'm a fast learner." A dry, skeptical smile touched the corner of his mouth. He looked around his workshop, a chaotic landscape of tools, scrap, and half-finished projects. His eyes landed on a pile of rusted metal brackets. "Fine," he said, a challenge in his voice. "You see those brackets? They need to be cleaned, sanded down to the bare metal. Think you can handle that?" He handed her a piece of coarse sandpaper and a wire brush. For the next hour she worked. It was awkward, clumsy work. The rust was stubborn, clinging to the metal like a disease. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate buttons of a camera, grew sore and cramped. The metallic dust settled on her clothes and skin. At one point, she pushed a stray strand of hair from her face, leaving a perfect rust-colored streak across her cheek. Jake worked nearby, pretending not to watch, though he was aware of her every frustrated sigh. Finally, he stopped his own work and came over, leaning against the workbench. "You've been at it for an hour," he said, his voice neutral. "Let's see." She held up a single bracket. It was a mess. Parts of it were scraped raw, while other patches of rust remained untouched. She looked down at her hands, which were red and grimy. "It's harder than it looks." "Everything worth doing is," he said simply. He took the bracket from her. "You're holding the paper wrong. You have to wrap it. Use the pressure from your palm, not your fingers." He demonstrated his large hands, moving with an easy, practiced efficiency. In seconds, a patch of clean, shining metal appeared. He handed it back to her. She looked from the gleaming spot to her own smudged face, reflected in a shard of mirror nearby. She saw the ridiculous rust-colored stripe, and instead of feeling humiliated, she laughed. A real, genuine laugh that echoed in the high ceilings of the station. What Jake asked, caught off guard by the sound. "I think I've discovered a new makeup style," she said, gesturing to her cheek. "We'll call it industrial chic." He stared at her for a moment, at the soot on her face and the genuine humor in her eyes, and for the first time he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a slight upward quirk of his lips, but it transformed his face, erasing some of the weariness from his eyes. "Don't quit your day job," he said, before turning back to his work, but the ice between them had cracked. That evening, over a meal of canned soup that she had helped him heat up, the conversation came more easily. So the phoenix, she began gesturing with her spoon toward the massive sculpture. Why a phoenix? Jake was quiet for a moment, stirring his soup. Because it's a story about rising from the ashes, he set his eyes on his creation. About something beautiful, being born from destruction. This whole place, it's an ash heap. The city wanted to tear it down. I convinced them to let me try to save what I could, to make something new out of what was left. "You're saving it," she said softly. It wasn't a question. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm trying. What about you? The camera you don't have. What kind of pictures do you take?" A shadow passed over her face. "I like taking pictures of things people don't notice," she said. The way light hits a crack in the pavement, the expression on a stranger's face when they think no one is watching. The beauty in things that aren't. Perfect. She looked at him, and he felt as though she were looking right through him. Later that night, long after the sound of Ava's soft breathing came from the cot, Jake sat at his workbench. The phoenix stood silent guard in the shadows. Under the intense, focused glare of his small desk lamp, an array of tiny, intricate gears and springs were laid out on a clean cloth. It was the delicate heart of the silver pocket watch. He held a minuscule screw with a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't just fixing it, he was studying it. The craftsmanship was old-world precise. It was an object of quality of history, an object that told a story he didn't yet understand. It was a key, and he was determined to find the lock it belonged to. A few days later, a fragile peace had settled. Ava had found her rhythm helping with small tasks, reading old paperbacks she'd found in the station master's office and watching him work. One evening he was at a critical point on the Phoenix, attempting a difficult weld on a joint deep within the wing structure. He needed to hold a heavy, awkward piece of steel in place while managing the torch with his other hand. He grunted with frustration, the metal slipping. He was about to give up for the night when he felt a presence beside him. It was Ava. She didn't say a word. She simply picked up a pair of his heavy leather work gloves, pulled them on, and reached for the piece of metal. "Tell me where," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He hesitated for only a second, then nodded. "Here, hold it steady. And whatever you do, don't look at the light." She gripped the steel, her knuckles white, even through the thick leather. He lowered his visor and brought the torch to life. A brilliant, blue-white flame hissed into existence, and the world outside its glare disappeared. For several long minutes, they were a team. The only sounds were the fierce hum of the torch and their own synchronized breathing. Her arms trembled slightly from the weight of the metal, but she held it perfectly still. Her trust in him, absolute. He finished the weld, a clean, strong seam that would hold for a century. He killed the torch, and the sudden silence felt profound. He lifted his visor. They were standing close, their faces only inches apart, illuminated by the soft glow of the cooling metal. The air was warm, smelling of burnt steel and ozone. He looked at her, at the smudge of soot that was still faintly visible on her cheek, at the determination in her eyes. And for the first time since she had arrived, the wall of suspicion inside him crumbled completely. In its place was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have in a very long time: respect. "Thanks," he said, his voice rougher, more full of emotion than he intended. Ava just nodded, a small, tired smile gracing her lips. In that silent, shared moment of creation, the distance between the abandoned station and the world of mansions and money seemed to dissolve into nothing. They were not a rich girl and a poor man. They were just two artists standing together in the quiet dark, having made something beautiful out of the broken pieces. The real world doesn't knock, it breaks down the door. For nearly a week, the abandoned train station had been a world unto itself, a pocket of time, governed only by the rising sun and the rhythm of their work. The unspoken secret of the silver watch lay dormant between them, a silent pact that had paradoxically woven a stronger thread of trust. The fear had receded from Ava's eyes, replaced by a quiet curiosity. The hard shell of Jake's solitude had been breached not by force, but by the steady, gentle pressure of her presence. The afternoon light, the color of warm honey, streamed through the high arched windows, bathing the grand concourse in a peaceful glow. Dust motes danced in the golden shafts of light. Jake was at his workbench, meticulously filing a newly forged metal petal, while Ava sat on an old luggage cart, a sketchbook open in her lap. She wasn't sketching the sculptures anymore. She was sketching his hands. She watched the way his long, calloused fingers moved with a watchmaker's precision, coaxing grace from stubborn steel. There was a comfortable silence between them, filled only by the rhythmic scrape of his file and the soft scratching of her charcoal pencil on paper. For the first time in years, Jake felt a sense of companionship that didn't feel like an intrusion. For the first time in her life, Ava felt something that resembled home. It was this peace so new and fragile that made the sound so jarring. It was the low, purring growl of a modern engine, a sound as alien in this place as a symphony in a tomb. It grew closer, then stopped just outside the station's main entrance. Jake's file froze mid-stroke. Ava's pencil stilled on the page. They looked at each other, the same question in their eyes. No one ever came out here. The old service road was a forgotten relic. Jake moved to the edge of the workshop, peering through a grimy pane of glass. A sleek black sedan, polished to a mirror, sat idling on the gravel. It was the kind of car that didn't just drive, it announced itself. It radiated wealth and power. A man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit emerged from the driver's side. He was of average height and build, but he moved with a clipped, efficient precision that made him seem taller. He adjusted his tie, scanned the station's crumbling facade with a dispassionate gaze, and then began walking toward the entrance. "Get back," Jake said, his voice a low, urgent command. "In the office." "Now." Ava didn't hesitate. She scrambled off the cart sketchbook, clutched to her chest, and disappeared into the shadows of the workshop, just as the heavy oak door of the station creaked open. The man stepped inside, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, his gaze sweeping across the cavernous space, taking in the decaying grandeur and the strange, beautiful sculptures that rose from the floor like metallic ghosts. His eyes finally settled on Jake. "Quite a place you've got here," the man said, his voice smooth and professional. "It's a work in progress," Jake replied, his tone guarded. He stepped out from the workshop, positioning himself between the visitor and the space where Ava was hidden. He held a heavy steel file in his hand, his grip casual but firm. "My name is Davies," the man said, extending a hand. Jake ignored it. Davies simply lowered his hand without a flicker of offense. "I'm looking for someone. A young woman. She ran away from home a little over a week ago. We have reason to believe she may have come through this area. Haven't seen anyone," Jake said flatly. "This place has been empty for 20 years besides me." Davies gave a thin, professional smile. People get lost. They look for shelter. She's young, early 20s with dark hair. Might seem distressed. Like I said, Jake repeated, his voice harder now. No one's here. Davies studied him for a long moment, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He seemed to weigh his options, then sighed a small, calculated sound of reluctance. Look, I'm not a cop. I'm just a man hired to do a job. Her family is very worried. Maybe this will help clarify the situation. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a slim smartphone. He tapped the screen and turned it toward Jake. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was a picture of Ava, but not the Ava he knew, with her smudged cheek and borrowed clothes. This was a different person entirely. She was standing in a grand ballroom, a crystal chandelier glittering above her. She wore a stunning evening gown of deep emerald green, a string of diamonds sparkling at her throat. Her hair was styled in elegant waves, her makeup flawless. She was smiling, but it wasn't the genuine, surprised smile he'd seen. It was a practiced, polished smile, beautiful and utterly empty. Jake felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at the image, his mind struggling to reconcile the two versions of the woman. The girl who laughed about industrial chic, and the poised socialite on the screen. Her name is Ava Harrington. Davies said, his voice dropping slightly as if sharing a confidence. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew that name, Marcus Harrington, the ruthless tycoon who bought companies, stripped them for parts, and laid off thousands without a second thought. A man who represented everything Jake despised about the world outside these walls. Her father is very eager to have her home. Davies continued, seeing the flicker of recognition in Jake's eyes. He swiped to another screen. It was a bank document, a wire transfer confirmation. He's offering a reward, $250,000, for information leading to her safe return. No questions asked. $250,000. The number didn't even sound real. It was an abstraction, a sum so vast it was meaningless. But it wasn't the number that hit Jake like a physical blow. It was the implication. In an instant, every moment they had shared was poisoned. Her awe at his work, their quiet meals, the comfortable silence, the shared laughter over her clumsiness. It all felt like a lie, a game, an amusement for a bored rich girl playing at being poor with his life, his work, his sanctuary as her stage. His old bitter prejudice, the one he thought had softened, came roaring back, a tidal wave of resentment. He felt like a fool, a charity case, a chapter in her grand adventure before she returned to her world of diamonds and empty smiles. His face became a mask. The warmth that had settled in his chest over the past week turned to a block of ice. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound, hollow emptiness. It was at that moment, as the silence stretched taut between the two men, that a small sound came from the workshop. Ava, who had been listening with a growing sense of dread, could not bear to let Jake face this alone. She stepped out from behind the phoenix, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Davies's professional calm didn't waver. He simply turned his head, his gaze locking onto her. He lowered his phone. "Miss Harrington," he said, his voice perfectly level. "Your father will be very pleased to know you're safe." The three of them stood frozen in a triangle of broken trust and exposed lies. Davies, the calm professional, whose job was now done. Ava, the terrified runaway, whose past had finally caught her. And Jake, silent and unmoving, his gaze shifting from the man in the suit to the girl he thought he knew. But the man looking at her was not the one who had smiled just an hour before. It was a stranger, his eyes as cold and hard as the winter steel of the railroad tracks outside. The heaviest things to fall are trust and steel. The name Ava Harrington hung in the air between them, a toxic cloud poisoning the fragile atmosphere they had built. It displaced the scent of ozone and old wood, replacing it with the cold metallic smell of money and power. The man Davies stood with the patient stillness of a predator whose prey had finally stumbled into the trap. His job was done. Jake's eyes, which had finally started to hold a glimmer of warmth when they looked at her, were now flint. He moved first, not toward Ava, but toward the man who had brought the outside world crashing in. "Get out," Jake said. His voice was not loud, but it had the low, dangerous rumble of an earthquake, building deep underground. Davies raised a placating hand. "Mr. Harrington will be very generous." "I said," Jake repeated, taking a step closer, forcing the taller man to take a step back. "Get out of my home." There was no arguing with the finality in his tone. Davies gave a curt, professional nod, his gaze flicking to Ava for a fraction of a second, a silent confirmation of his victory. Then he turned his polished shoes, clicking a sharp, triumphant rhythm on the marble floor as he walked away. The heavy oak door thudded shut behind him, the sound sealing the two of them inside a tomb of shattered illusions. The silence that followed was immense, suffocating. Ava could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. She took a tentative step toward him, her hand outstretched. "Jake, please! Let me explain." Explain what he turned to face her, and the coldness in his eyes made her flinch. He wasn't yelling. It was worse. His voice was quiet, controlled, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Explain what, Ava Harrington? That your name buys and sells people like me for sport. That your father can put a price tag on your head like you're a prize racehorse. No, it's not like that. Isn't it?" He cut her off, a bitter, mirthless smile twisting his lips. "What was it you said? You like taking pictures of things that aren't perfect." Was that what this was? A little poverty tourism adventure. Get some pictures of the noble savage in his native habitat before heading back to the country club. How does the struggling artist live? How does he eat? How easily can he be fooled? Each word was a precisely aimed blow. He was throwing her own curiosity and compassion back in her face, twisting them into weapons. "That's not fair," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "That's not what this was. You know it wasn't." "I don't know anything," he shot back, his voice rising just a fraction. "I know a girl shows up at my door in the middle of a storm, looking like a drowned kitten. I know she talks about art and beauty and broken things. I know I started to believe her." He took a step toward her, his jaw tight. "I know I was a fool. It was real," she insisted, her desperation making her voice shake. "Everything that happened in here. It was the only real thing in my entire life. You don't know what I was running from. You don't know what my life is like. Oh, I think I have a pretty good idea." He scoffed. "A life so terrible you had to wear $100,000 coat to run away from it. A life of so much suffering that you just happened to have diamonds at your throat in your last family photo. Don't you dare talk to me about suffering." His prejudice, the deep, ugly thing he kept chained in the cellar of his heart, was now loose, and it was ravenous. It devoured every good memory they had made, leaving only the bitter taste of class and resentment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver pocket watch. It gleamed in the dim light, its surface polished, its hands no longer frozen. He'd fixed it. The crystal was clear, the silver shone with a soft, warm luster. It looked alive again. Was this part of the game, too? He asked, his voice dripping with a corrosive sarcasm. The lost little family heirloom. "See if the poor mechanic will take the bait." See if he'll waste his time fixing your expensive toy just for a pat on the head. He didn't throw it at her. He did something worse. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the steel workbench beside her. It landed with a sharp, metallic clatter that felt like a slap. There he said, his voice flat. "Your property. Now get the rest of it and get out." He gestured toward the cot, the blanket, the life she had briefly inhabited. That was the moment she broke. The accusation, the dismissal, the complete negation of everything she felt. It was too much. No. She cried a raw, ragged sound. She rushed forward, not thinking, needing to make him see, to make him understand. She grabbed for his arm, her fingers closing on the rough fabric of his shirt. "Jake, you have to listen to me." He recoiled from her touch, as if he'd been burned. It was an instinctive, powerful flinch, a man pulling back from a source of pain. He stumbled backward, his body rigid with anger and betrayal. He wasn't looking where he was going. His heel caught the heavy steel base of the Phoenix. There was a sickening, grinding groan of stressed metal. The entire sculpture, all 2 tons of it, shuddered. The massive, newly welded wing, the one they had worked on together, the one she had held so steady for him, wobbled precariously. For one horrifying, suspended second, it hung there, a monument to their fragile partnership. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the fresh weld snapped. Time seemed to slow down. The wing, a masterpiece of forged steel and rusted feathers, tore free from the body of the Phoenix. It fell tumbling through the air in a slow, graceful arc of destruction before it crashed onto the marble floor. The impact was a cataclysm, a deafening, echoing roar of shattering metal and splintering stone that shook the very foundations of the old station. It was the sound of a giant falling, the sound of something beautiful being irrevocably broken. In the ringing silence that followed, there was nothing but the soft metallic tinkle of a single gear rolling away from the wreckage. Ava stood frozen, her hand still outstretched toward him. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. Jake didn't look at her. He didn't look at anything. He just stared at the mangled heap of steel on the floor. The great wing, the symbol of hope, of rebirth from the ashes, was now just a pile of twisted, worthless scrap. His masterpiece, his future, his one chance, ruined. The furious anger on his face was gone. In its place was a look of such absolute hollow devastation that it was 1,000 times more terrifying. It was the face of a man who had not only lost his work, but had just been forced to watch as his own hands helped to destroy it. The storm was no longer just inside the steel. It had consumed him whole. Sometimes the greatest act of love looks like the ultimate betrayal. The echo of the crash faded, but the silence it left behind was a living thing. It was heavier than the steel, colder than the marble floor. It filled every corner of the station, pressing in on them, suffocating the air. The great, beautiful wing of the Phoenix lay in a mangled heap, a monument to the ruin of the last 10 minutes. One of its meticulously forged feathers had broken off, lying a few feet away, like a single metallic tear. Jake didn't move. He didn't rage or curse. The fire that had burned so brightly in his eyes just moments before had been extinguished, leaving behind nothing but cold, grey ash. He stared at the wreckage, his face slack with a kind of shock that went deeper than anger. It was the silent, catatonic grief of a man who had just witnessed the death of a dream. He had spent months pouring his hope, his frustration, and his artistry into that sculpture. It was more than metal, it was his future, and he had just helped destroy it. Ava stood frozen, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in her ears. Guilt, sharp and sickening, coiled in her stomach. This was her fault. Her chaos, her world, her name. They were a contagion, and she had brought the sickness into his sanctuary. She watched him saw the life drain from his posture, the light from his eyes. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't even acknowledging her existence. It was as if she, too, had been broken into worthless pieces on the floor, and that she realized was the most unbearable thing of all. A new feeling began to crystallize through her panic and guilt, a hard, cold resolve. She couldn't fix what was broken between them, not with words. The trust had been shattered. But the sculpture was just steel. It was metal and machinery. It could be mended. She looked at the wreckage, then back at Jake's empty face. She had broken his one hope. She had to be the one to build it back, no matter what it cost her. The decision settled in her heart like a block of ice. It was a terrible, sickening choice, a poison she would have to willingly drink. But there was no other way. She needed a phone. Her eyes darted around the workshop. She saw Jake's old flip phone sitting on his workbench, but she couldn't bring herself to touch it. It felt like another violation of his world. Then she remembered. The sleek black sedan. "Pois is Mr. Davies." She turned and ran. Her footsteps, which had been so hesitant before, were now swift and certain. She burst through the heavy oak doors and into the cool, damp evening air. The black car was still there, a silent, predatory shape parked on the gravel. She prayed it would be unlocked. Her hand closed over the cold chrome of the handle, and she pulled. The door clicked open. Relief washed over her, quickly followed by a fresh wave of dread. She slid into the passenger seat. The interior smelled of expensive leather and air freshener, a sterile scent that made her stomach turn. And there on the seat beside her was Davies's smart phone. She snatched it up, its smooth, cold weight feeling alien in her trembling hand. She knew the number. It was etched into her memory like a scar. With shaking fingers, she navigated the screen and dialed. It rang twice before he answered. There was no greeting, just the cold, familiar sound of his voice. "I assumed you'd call eventually." There was no surprise in his tone, no relief, only the flat, triumphant sound of a man whose calculations had proven correct. "It's me," she said, her own voice sounding thin and distant. "Are you ready to come home?" he asked. It wasn't a question born of fatherly concern. It was the closing of a business deal. Ava took a deep, shuddering breath, steeling herself. "I need something," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "A favor." She could almost hear his disdainful smile over the line. A favor she didn't let him mock her. She explained the situation, stripping it of all emotion, presenting it as a logistical problem. An artist. A commissioned sculpture now broken. A specific, custom-fabricated mechanical component in the wing's articulation system now destroyed. Rare. Needing to be sourced and replicated by the best engineers immediately. She knew he could do it. With a few phone calls, he could move mountains. There was a pause on the other end of the line. He was considering the terms, and in return he finally asked, his voice smooth as silk. This was it. The price. Ava closed her eyes. The image of Jake's devastated face burned into the back of her eyelids. "I'll come home," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I'll do what you want. No more running." "The car will be there in an hour," he said. The line went dead. She sat in the silent, leather-scented car for a long moment, the dead phone still pressed to her ear. She had done it. She had traded her freedom for a piece of machinery. With leaden limbs, she got out of the car and walked back into the station. She placed the investigator's phone carefully on the edge of Jake's workbench. He was still sitting on the old wooden crate, but he had moved. He was now holding the single broken metal feather, turning it over and over in his hands. He looked up as she approached his eyes, as empty as the ruined concourse around them. She had rehearsed 1,000 things to say 1,000 ways to try and explain, but now, looking at his face, she knew that words were useless. They were the currency of a world that no longer existed between them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It was all she had left. An apology for the lies, for the intrusion, for the destruction, for the choice she had just made. An apology for everything. He didn't answer. He didn't even blink. He just continued to stare at the broken feather in his hands, his face a mask of impenetrable grief. There was nothing left to do. With a final heartbroken look at the man who had shown her a glimpse of a different life, she turned. She walked away past the silent, beautiful sculptures, past the cot where she had woken up to a new world, and out through the heavy oak doors. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The sound of her footsteps faded, leaving Jake alone in the vast, echoing silence. He sat there for a long time, the broken feather still in his hand. His gaze drifted from the wreckage on the floor to the workbench. The silver pocket watch lay there, its polished face gleaming softly in the dim light. Perfect. Whole. A mocking reminder of the one thing he had managed to fix in a world that had just been shattered. Faintly from outside came the sound of a powerful engine, the quiet crunch of tires on gravel. The car had arrived. Jake slowly closed his hand around the sharp edges of the metal feather, the pain a dull, distant anchor. He shut his eyes, and a single tear he hadn't known was there escaped, tracing a slow, hot path through the grime on his cheek. The hardest journey is the one back to the place that broke you. The silence that followed Ava's departure was a different kind of quiet. It was not the peaceful, productive silence of an artist at work, but the dead, hollow silence of a tomb. For 3 days, the train station was a monument to inertia. Jake moved through it like a ghost, the fire in his forge, and in his soul extinguished. He didn't touch the phoenix. The magnificent ruined wing lay where it had fallen, a constant physical reminder of the cataclysm. He would wake, walk the length of the cold concourse, and then retreat, the weight of the failure too heavy to bear. His tools lay clean but unused on his workbench. He would pick up a wrench, feel its familiar heft, and set it down again. The drive, the creative furnace that had always burned inside him, was gone. All that remained were the cold ashes of resentment and a pride that had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. On his workbench, next to the idle tools, sat the silver pocket watch. It was perfect, its ticking heart now silent, a gleaming, mocking trophy of his own foolishness. On the 4th day, a new sound broke the stillness. It wasn't the purr of a luxury sedan, but the guttural rumble and squeal of a heavy delivery truck backing up the old service road. Jake roused from a listless trance, moved to the grimy window. He watched with a familiar, weary suspicion as 2 men in work overalls jumped out and began unlatching the back of their truck. Then the passenger door opened. It was Ava. She looked different. The ghost of the elegant socialite was gone, and so was the lost, frightened runaway. The woman who stepped out of the truck was dressed in simple dark jeans, sturdy boots, and a plain canvas jacket. She looked tired, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes held a new, unfamiliar resolve. She didn't look like she belonged in his world or her old one. She looked like she was building a new one from the ground up. She directed the 2 men as they wrestled a large, heavy wooden crate from the truck and set it carefully on the ground just outside the station's main doors. After a brief word and a signature on a clipboard, the men climbed back into their truck and drove away, leaving Ava standing alone with the crate. She took a deep breath, then turned and pushed open the heavy oak door. She walked inside her boots, making a soft, steady sound on the marble floor. The air was cold and stagnant. She saw him standing in the shadows of the workshop, watching her, his face an unreadable mask. She didn't offer a greeting or an apology. She simply gestured back toward the open doorway. "That's for you," she said, her voice clear and steady, echoing slightly in the vast hall. "It's the replacement mechanism. For the wing." Jake said nothing. He just stared at her, his jaw tight. She walked closer, stopping a respectful distance away. "I had it commissioned. The engineers used the original schematics. It's an exact replica." He finally spoke, his voice rough and corroded like a piece of rusted steel. "I don't want it." "It's not a gift, Jake," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It's restitution. I don't want your father's money." He shot back, the words laced with a familiar bitterness. "I don't want his charity. I don't want anything that man has touched." "He didn't pay for it," Ava said, and for the first time he saw a flicker of the fire she now possessed. "I did." He let out a short, harsh laugh. "With what, the trust fund?" "It's the same thing." "No," she said, taking another step closer. "It's not." She looked him directly in the eye, and the force of her conviction made him pause. "When I called him, I didn't beg. I made a deal. He wanted me back, under his control, in his house, playing by his rules. I told him I would return, that I would stop running. And in exchange for my compliance, he would use his resources to fix this one thing for me. A parting gift to the life I was leaving behind." She paused, letting the words sink in. "He thinks he won. He thinks he bought me back. But what I really bought with that deal was time. And I bought this." She pointed again to the crate outside. "This isn't from him. It's from me. I paid for it with the only currency I had left. So don't you dare call it his." Jake was silent, the architecture of his anger beginning to crack. He had imagined her returning to a life of luxury, forgetting him and this place as a strange dream. He had not imagined her fighting, negotiating, turning her own surrender into a weapon. Ava walked to the open doorway, and with a grunt of effort, began to push the heavy crate inside, sliding it across the marble floor. She managed to get it just inside the threshold, before stopping, breathing heavily. She looked at him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. "The damage was my fault," she said, her voice softer now, all the fight gone, replaced by a simple, aching truth. "I brought the storm in here, and I broke your work. I broke—" She stopped herself. "I can't undo that, but I can help you fix this." She pried the lid off the crate with a crowbar she'd brought. Inside, nestled in a bed of thick, custom-cut foam, lay the mechanism. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, all polished steel and brass gleaming under the pale light. It was intricate, it was perfect, it was hope in physical form. "What happens next is your choice," she said quietly. "You can let your pride turn this place into a graveyard. You can let that broken wing on the floor be the end of the story." She placed her hands on the edge of the gleaming new part, her fingers resting on the cold, smooth steel. Or she looked up at him, her eyes pleading but her voice strong. "You can let me help you build again." The offer hung in the silent, heavy air between them. It was more than an offer to help fix a sculpture. It was an offer to mend what was broken between them. An offer of partnership, an act of faith. Jake stared at the perfect machine in the crate. He stared at the mangled wreckage of his phoenix. He stared at her hand, so small and determined, resting on the steel. Everything in him, every bitter lesson life had taught him, screamed at him to say no, to protect himself, to send her and her world away for good. But his eyes betrayed him. They drifted to the single broken feather still lying on the floor, and he saw not just a ruin, but a promise yet to be fulfilled. He took a single ragged breath. His own hand, scarred and calloused, lifted from his side. It moved slow and uncertain through the dead air toward the crate, toward her, toward the first terrifying step of building something new from the ashes. The strongest welds are the ones that join two broken pieces. Jake's hand, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of wrestling, with steel moved through the dead air between them. It didn't tremble. It settled next to hers on the edge of the wooden crate, his knuckles brushing against her fingers. He didn't say yes. He didn't have to. The simple, quiet act of contact was his answer. It was his surrender, not to her or her money, but to the flicker of hope she had carried back into the tomb of his workshop. A long moment passed, a silent acknowledgement of the weight of his choice. Then, with a shared, determined nod, they turned to the work. The days that followed were a blur of intense, focused labor. The air, once stagnant with grief, was now filled with the shriek of the grinder, the sharp crackle of the welder, and the low rhythmic clang of hammer on steel. They worked like surgeons, carefully dismantling the wreckage of the fallen wing, assessing the damage, and preparing for the delicate transplant of the new mechanism. Their interactions at first were stripped of all emotion, pared down to the essential language of their task. Pass me the half-inch socket. Watch the leverage on that joint. The weld needs to be hotter. They moved around each other with a cautious, professional grace, the shared work becoming a neutral ground where they could exist without having to confront the emotional debris scattered around them. It was a safer, more manageable kind of mending. But as they toiled together, cleaning the grime and rust from the old steel, measuring the precise fit of the new, the walls between them began to erode. They started to anticipate each other's needs. A hand ready with a tool before it was asked for a mug of hot coffee appearing on the workbench at just the right moment. The shared physical effort was forging a new, more resilient kind of bond, one built not on whispered confidences, but on the solid foundation of sweat and shared purpose. One evening they sat on an old wooden crate, exhausted, sharing a can of stew, heated over a hot plate. They were both covered in a fine layer of grease and metal dust. The silence was different now. It wasn't tense or awkward. It was the comfortable, weary silence of two people who had accomplished something together. Jake's gaze drifted to the workbench where the silver pocket watch still sat a silent observer to their labors. He had picked it up the day she returned, his fingers closing around its smooth, solid weight. He hadn't put it away. He'd left it there in the open, a question he hadn't yet had the courage to ask. Now he did. "The watch," he said, his voice quiet. "You never told me." The real story. Ava stopped eating her spoon, hovering over the can. She looked at the watch, its silver case, glowing softly in the dim light. She took a deep breath. It was time. It belonged to my grandfather. She began her voice, a soft murmur. My mother's father. He wasn't a Harrington. He was a clockmaker. A man who lived in a small house with a small workshop and who, according to my mother, was the happiest man she ever knew. She stared off into the shadows of the station, her eyes seeing a time and place far from there. My mother. She fell in love with my father's power, his ambition. She thought it would make her feel safe, important. But she spent 20 years in a gilded cage, surrounded by beautiful, expensive things she didn't care about. The only thing she truly treasured was that watch. It was her reminder of a different kind of life, a different kind of man. A life where value was measured in skill and love, not stock prices. Her voice cracked slightly. She always told me, "Ava, don't make my mistake. Don't ever choose a beautiful cage over a messy, imperfect freedom. But she never had the courage to leave him herself. She just faded. And when she died, my father put all of her things in storage, as if to erase any evidence that she was ever unhappy. She looked at Jake, her eyes glistening. I found the watch in an old box of her letters. It was my one connection to her, to him, to the idea that a different life was possible. Running away. It wasn't just about escaping my father or an arranged marriage. It was about trying not to become my mother. It was about trying to find a place where things were valued for what they were not, what they were worth. Jake listened, his gaze never leaving her face. And in her story, he finally saw the truth. He saw the intricate hidden mechanism behind her own desperate flight. Her struggle was as real as his, her cage just as confining, only its bars were made of gold instead of rusted steel. The last of his prejudice, the last of his bitter resentment dissolved. He wasn't looking at Ava Harrington anymore. He was just looking at Ava. The next day they approached the Phoenix for the final critical task, attaching the new wing. As he lowered his welding visor, he caught her eye. She gave him a small, steady nod. He fired up the torch. She held the heavy wing in place, her stance solid, her hands sure. This time it was different. There was no fear, no hesitation. Just a deep, unspoken trust. They moved in perfect concert, two halves of a single purpose. He laid down a seam of molten steel, a perfect glowing scar that joined the new with the old, the polished with the rusted, the past with the future. When it was done, they stood back, side by side. The Phoenix was whole again. It was magnificent. The new wing with its gleaming, perfect mechanism didn't look out of place. It looked like it had always belonged, its strength supporting the beautiful weathered imperfections of the original form. It was no longer just his sculpture. It was theirs. A tired smile touched Ava's lips. She looked at the finished masterpiece, then at her own grease-stained hands. "See," she said, her voice light with a playful exhaustion. "I'm useful. Not just for holding silver forks." Jake looked at her, at the smudge of soot on her cheek that she'd missed, at the genuine, brilliant light in her eyes. And he smiled. A real smile, broad and warm, that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. It was a smile of relief, of gratitude, of a joy he thought he'd lost forever. "Okay," he said, his voice a low, happy rumble. "I'll give you that." He reached out his hand, bypassing the tools and the cold steel. He took a hand, his rough, calloused fingers lacing through hers. They fit together perfectly. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, looking up at the resurrected Phoenix, the silence of the great station, no longer empty, but filled with the vast, unspoken promise of a new beginning. In the end, the story of Jake and Ava reminds us that the most beautiful things in this world are often the ones that have been mended. It's easy to love something perfect and polished, but it takes a rare kind of courage to see the value in what's been broken, whether it's a life, a dream, or the fragile trust between two people. Their journey wasn't just about finding love in a forgotten place. It was about the hard, messy, necessary work of forgiveness, and the realization that sometimes our greatest strength is forged in the very places where we were once shattered. How many of us have walked away from something beautiful simply because we were afraid to look past its cracks? We would be so honored to hear your own thoughts on this in the comments below. If their story of mending what was broken moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who believes in second chances. And for more stories that find the light in unexpected places, we hope you'll subscribe to our community. Thank you for listening.